This evening, I would like to turn our attention to something in the Scriptures that certainly pertains to the events of the last days. Some of you may have seen the news item that was released in the last couple of weeks. There is a group in Israel known as the Temple Mount Faithful who have been involved in a great deal of study in terms of the temple itself, in terms of the restoration of the Levitical priesthood. There are actually schools there for the priests and the Levites, or there has been the putting together of many of the priestly garb, much of the priestly garb and vestments. Many of the articles of the temple have been reconstructed according to the instructions of the Bible and what has been preserved in Jewish tradition. One interesting thing to note, this group, shortly before the Feast of Tabernacles, had a meeting that was attended by a cabinet minister from Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet, and they have stated their avowed aim to lay a cornerstone for the Third Temple during this Feast of Tabernacles. In fact, today is their day. The day, of course, we're looking at I don't know, whatever it is, 16 hours difference or 14 hours difference, something like that between here and Israel. But what they will wind up doing or be allowed to do, we'll have to wait and see. But it does bring to mind something that Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24, and something that I would like for us to turn our attention to here this evening. In Matthew 24, of course, Christ was answering the question of what would be the sign of His coming and of the end of the age, as well as the question that was raised by His statement that there would not be one stone left standing on another that wouldn't be overthrown, speaking of the temple there. And the disciples wanted to know, when will these things be? When is that going to happen, and what will be the sign of your coming? And Christ went through a number of things that were to occur, and the things that would go on. And when he comes on down in verse 14 of Matthew 24, he says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, then shall the end come." Verse 15, When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso reads, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. He goes on talking about pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath. Verse 20. Verse 21, For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Now we find there is a sequence of events that is described here. It talks about the onset of the tribulation. It talks about a time of intense persecution. It talks about a time that would escalate to the point that unless God intervened, there would simply no flesh be saved alive. But those days will be shortened. He talks about those in Judea fleeing to the mountains. What is it that sets the stage for the tribulation and for this that is described right here? Well, it's the events of verse 15, what is spoken of or referred to here in Matthew 24:15 as the abomination of desolation. Now, a lot of people have speculated about that and talked about that. Christ clearly identified what He was talking about when He said, "You shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet." So it is the abomination that Daniel described. When you see that, stand in the holy place. All right, now the abomination involves the holy place, and it is the abomination spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Now what I would like to do this evening is to go back to the book of Daniel to look and see what Daniel actually said about the abomination. We find that primarily it is we find several chapters in the book of Daniel that address the subject of the abomination of desolation. I would also like to call your attention to what the Jews of the first century understood about the abomination spoken of by Daniel. I'm going to read from a historical work, the first book of Maccabees. That was never intended as a part of the Bible. It's not considered a part of the Bible, never was by the Jews, but it was an historical work that recorded events it was written about a century and a half prior to the birth of Christ. And it records events in the 2nd century B.C. It's a contemporary historical account. It was a widely known account in the 1st century, and it clearly preserves what the Jews of Jesus' day understood about the historical fulfillment of the things that were talked of in the book of Daniel. And I think that we will see. You know, the Bible often, in terms of prophecy, there is a historical fulfillment that is a type of an end-time fulfillment. One of the things that is important in understanding the events of the end time is to understand the historical events, to understand the historical type, and to see what actually happened historically. As an example of that, we find that Jesus in Matthew 24 used the events that occurred in 70 A.D. as a type of the end time. You see, the question that he answered in the beginning of Matthew 24 was prompted by his statement to the disciples that the beautiful buildings of the temple that they were looking at would not remain intact. In fact, he said, not one stone shall be left standing on another. Well, that occurred within 40 years of the time Jesus spoke those words. The temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed. And the temple, that was what is normally termed the second temple. It was the temple built by Zerubbabel and refurbished by Herod. It was the first temple, the Solomon's temple. This was the second temple. And the events that are described in Matthew 24, on one level, there is, for many of the descriptions given in Matthew 24, there was a historic fulfillment in 70 A.D. with the destruction of Jerusalem, with the flight of the church from Jerusalem, with the events that surrounded those things. But clearly, when you go through Matthew 24, the primary implication of Matthew 24 is for the end time and is for the events, the events that will culminate in the return of Jesus Christ. He didn't return in 70 A.D. Those events, historically, were merely a type. What happened to Jerusalem? Jerusalem is used as a type of what will happen to the house of Israel. Let me just show you. This is we can go back to the book of Ezekiel and see that. Ezekiel 4, verse 1. Ezekiel was told, "You also, son of man, take you a tile and lay it before you and portray upon it the city, even Jerusalem." So Ezekiel took this tile and he portrayed the city. It was like a little model city, and he set it up and laid siege against it and built a fort against it and cast a mount against it and a camp also against it and set battering rams round about. So he set up sort of like a little toy fort. And here he had this tile that was representative of the city of Jerusalem. And he was told to take an iron pan and set it for a wall of iron. And he was told all of these things. Now notice the end of verse 3. "This shall be a sign to the house of Israel." Oh, you see, the siege that Ezekiel was to portray concerning Jerusalem was in reality a sign for the house of Israel. The events that Jesus described in Matthew 24 that had an historic fulfillment in 70 A.D. were a type, were a sign, and tied in with Old Testament prophecies that relate to ultimately what will happen to the whole house of Israel, though certainly Jerusalem is included. Now, here in Matthew 24, Jesus talked about the abomination spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Well, let's go back to the book of Daniel, and let's see what Daniel had to say about this. First, let's get a little bit of an overview of the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 1, and I'm going to primarily be reading from the Jewish Publication Society translation from the Sonsino version of Daniel, but you'll find that the translation is very similar. I think there's some places where it makes it a little more clear. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and part of the vessels of the house of God, and he carried them into the land of Shinar. And we find that he also brought certain of the children of Israel, and of the seed royal, and of the nobles, youth in whom was no blemish. Here's described on down in the first few verses of Daniel 1. This is Daniel and his friends. Daniel was perhaps a teenager, most likely, let's just say around 15 years of age. That would be a pretty good approximation, that he was brought there away from Jerusalem to Babylon, he and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, chapter 1 tells the story of their coming to Babylon and the way that they made a decision to obey God in the context of all of the pressures to conform to pagan society. Chapter 2 then introduces the first vision. It was a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and it was the time that God began to use Daniel as a very young man to interpret dreams and visions. This is the vision of the great image that represented the succession of the 4 world-ruling Gentile kingdoms, from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome, coming on down until at the end of chapter 2, the stone without hands, the stone of supernatural origin, comes down and crushes the toes of the image, and the whole thing turns to dust. Well, in chapter 3, we read the story of Nebuchadnezzar setting up an image of gold. He was so impressed with his dream, he obviously didn't get the point. He put this thing together and was going to have everybody worship it. And of course, you remember the story. That's the account of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the fiery furnace, and God delivering them. Chapter 4 continues the story on with Nebuchadnezzar having another dream. And this was much later in his life. He had another dream, and this was the dream of the great tree. We talked about that this morning in the sermon. And the tree was cut down. And Daniel explained to him that he was going to, this represented him being driven forth from his kingdom, from his power. And he was. Chapter 4 records that, and then we went into the prophetic implications of it this morning. Chapter 5 is the account of Belshazzar's feast and the handwriting on the wall. And again, we went into that this morning. The fall of Babylon is recorded in chapter 5. Well, chapter 6 then introduces us to Darius the Mede, who was a relative of King Cyrus, and who actually took over became as king in Babylon. Cyrus and his armies went elsewhere, and Darius was actually left to rule over Babylon, and Cyrus did not actually return for a period of several years. Daniel's dealings with Darius are recorded here in chapter 6. This is the account of Daniel in the lion's den. You know, Darius was persuaded to make this decree that no one should pray to any other god except him. And then, of course, there were those who were waiting to accuse Daniel, and he was thrown into the lion's den and was, of course, delivered by God. Chapter 7 goes back to an earlier time. It's a vision that Daniel had. We sort of run through the historical account in the first 6 chapters of Daniel with inset visions, but primarily have just sort of run through the story of the highlights of Daniel's life. In chapter 7, we have the record of a vision that Daniel saw, and most of the rest of the book of Daniel consists of Daniel's 4 visions, beginning in chapter 7, 8, 9, and 10. And the vision in chapter 10 has implications that are recorded on in chapters 11 and 12. Now, we want to Daniel, in the earlier part of the book, interpreted visions that others had. Now, beginning in Daniel chapter 7, we have visions that Daniel had. And the first vision is in many ways a parallel to Nebuchadnezzar's vision of chapter 2. That's one of the things that helps us understand it, because the same story is told from two different perspectives. In Daniel 2, we have a description of 4 kingdoms that culminate with the return of Christ and the setting up of the kingdom of God. That's made very plain by the time you get down to Daniel 2:42 and on beyond that, that the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. Well, Daniel 7 records again 4 kingdoms. Here, in the context of animals, he sees 4 great beasts coming up from the sea, different from one another. Daniel 7:3. The first was like a lion that had wings. And then he saw, secondly, he saw a great bear come up. That's described in verse 5. And then in verse 6, he saw a leopard that had 4 heads and 4 wings come up. This is the third creature. And then the fourth beast is described beginning in verse 7. And he goes on down and was trying to figure out what all of this was. And so he was told that these represented 4 kings or kingdoms, verse 17, and the reference is on down, comes on down in verse 23. The fourth beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon the earth, and he comes all the way down that to the conclusion that the kingdom, verse 27, and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Their kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey. Now, this brings us down. Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 are very easy to parallel, because you have a description of 4 kingdoms. And you culminate with the setting up of the Messiah's kingdom. And so those 2 chapters enable us to go through and sort of fill. Each one adds in details, you see, and it sort of enables us to fill in. Now, beginning in chapter 8, we pick up what we're going to concentrate mostly on here this evening. This was during the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. Daniel saw a vision, and in his vision, he was in Shushan, the palace in the province of Elam. That's here in verse 2. And he lifted up his eyes, verse 3, and saw, and behold, there stood before the stream a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, and no beast could stand before it. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. And as I was considering, verse 5, a he-goat came from the west over the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram which had the 2 horns, which I saw standing before the stream, and he ran at him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close to the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and broke his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him. He cast him to the ground and trampled on him. Verse 8, the he-goat magnified himself exceedingly, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up the appearance of 4 horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south and the east and the beauteous land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven. And some of the host were cast to the ground. He magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And from him the continual burnt offering was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And the host was given over to it, together with the continual burnt offering, through transgression. And verse 13, I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said unto that certain one which spoke, how long shall be the vision concerning the continual burnt offering and the transgression that causes appalment? Now that is translated in the King James, the abomination here. This is, let me read it. Read the parallel here out of the Okay, the numbering system here of the verses is slightly different in the King James and in the Jewish translation. The text is the same, but the verses are numbered in a slightly different way. Okay, so I heard one saint speaking, I'll read it out of the King James. How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 evenings and mornings. This is the literal translation. This is the Jewish translation. Unto 2,300 evenings and mornings, then shall the sanctuary be victorious, or then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, Daniel saw this vision. Now, we've gone through and we've looked at that. Now, we don't have to just guess what all these goats and horns and all of this is, because as we come on down through the story, what we find is that these things are identified. Verse 20. The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the rough he-goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. That would be Alexander the Great. So now we have clearly identified what we're looking at. We had visions earlier that started with Babylon and came down to Rome, but now we're zeroing in on a particular time in the history immediately ahead of Daniel. The Persians were already, they came to power during the latter time of Daniel's lifetime. Now Daniel saw in his vision this ram with the two horns symbolizing the Medes and the Persians. Cyrus the Great united the Medes and the Persians. The Persians were the latter horn that came up last but became the dominant part of the empire. Cyrus, in his person, he was the heir to both thrones through his mother and through his father. He was the heir to both the Medes and the Persians, united them in one empire. We see the description here of the ram with two horns representing the king of the Medes and the Persians. Well, the rough he-goat, the one that came charging through from the west with the great horn, is described right here. This represents the king of Greece, and this represents the first king is represented by that great horn. So Alexander the Great's empire came forth from the west, from Europe, came across Asia Minor, and absolutely devastated everything in its path, totally conquered all the way to the Indus River. Now, Daniel goes on in verse 22, as for that which was broken in the place whereof four stood up, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not with his power. You see, when Alexander died, some of his generals began to squabble, trying to gain control of his empire. It ultimately came out to 4 of his generals that managed to each carve out a kingdom for themselves. And that's Macedonia and Greece. The old portion, the original portion of Alexander's empire went to one of his generals, to Cassander. Thrace and Bithynia, which would be there in the area of modern-day Turkey, ancient Asia Minor, went to Lysimachus. And then the area of Syria and Babylon to the east went to Seleucus. And the area to the south, Egypt, and those portions down in portions into the Arabian Peninsula went to Ptolemy, another of his generals. So these were the 4, sort of in 4 different directions. These 4 wound up with the empire, divided among themselves. It continued as a Greek language, Greek culture, Greek religion, Greek philosophy, all of these things. It was a Greek empire, but it was no longer unified. It was divided among these 4 generals who became kings in their own right, and who were continually trying to get part of what belonged to the other kings. See, they all wanted to see Alexander's empire reestablished, but they all wanted to be the head of it. And this continued on down with their various descendants. Now, the what we also saw was that verse 23 of Daniel 8, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have completed their transgression, there shall stand up a king of fierce countenance and understanding stratagems, a very crafty, cunning individual. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, shall prosper and do, and he shall destroy them that are mighty and the people of the saints. And through his cunning he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, shall magnify himself in his heart. And in time of security shall he destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince, and he shall be broken without hand. The vision of the evenings and mornings which you saw is true. Now, what we saw earlier, this vision of the evenings and mornings, the King James translates it in verse 14, 2,300 days. But if you look it up, the word day in Hebrew is yom, like in Yom Kippur. That's not the word that's used here. It's not the normal word for day, but rather it's the word evening and morning. Now, we're going to look at that. What we're told is that he will cause, in verse 11, he will take away the continual burnt offering. This little horn described here. And how long would he take away the burnt offering described in verse 11? Well, the answer is given in verse 14, 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then shall the sanctuary be victorious, or shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, let's look historically at what took place. I want to call your attention to some things in the book of 1 Maccabees. It starts out that it happened after that Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came out of the land of Kittim, had smitten Darius, king of the Medes and Persians, that he reigned in his stead the first over Greece. And it goes on down. And Alexander reigned 12 years, and then he died. His servants bare rule, every one in his place. And then it goes on to say, there came out of one of them a wicked root, Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king, who had been a hostage in Rome. He reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. That was figured from the beginning of the Seleucid dynasty. That's figured from the year 312, 311. That was the year that Seleucus conquered Babylon, and that was the year. That was the means of reckoning. The 137th year of the kingdom would translate into 175 B.C. That's when Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, came to the throne. Now, again, continuing the history. Now, remember, Maccabees is a contemporary historical account of the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. And what we're going to see is the Jews clearly understood and identified Antiochus Epiphanes as the little horn described here in Daniel chapter 8. Here's the history of the time. In those days there went out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the nations round about us, for since we departed from them we've had much sorrow. This device pleased them well. They built a place of exercise at Jerusalem according to the customs of the heathen, made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief. You see, the whole idea of Alexander the Great was to create one world. He wanted his soldiers to intermarry with the women in whatever nations he conquered. He wanted one religion. He wanted one language, one philosophy. He wanted to create one world. Now, that wasn't an original idea with Alexander. Nimrod wanted to do the same thing, remember? And, you know, we're coming to a time when that concept is going to be pushed again. It's the old Babylonian concept. Alexander conquered Babylon, wound up actually dying in Babylon. But this concept of blending everything together was very much a part of the Hellenistic approach, the Hellenistic attitude. Now, there was a lot of pressure brought to bear. Antiochus wanted everybody to be of one nation, everybody to sort of blend in, be part of the same system, adopt the same religion, adopt the same philosophy. Well, there were those in Israel who said, we have a lot of trouble trying to be different. Why don't we just fit in? Let's do like they do. And so they sought to persuade many and said, let's, enter into an agreement. And they did various things according to the custom of the nations. Well, it talks about Antiochus that he thought to reign over Egypt, that he might have dominion over two realms. He entered Egypt with a great multitude, made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt, and they got strong cities in the land of Egypt. He took spoils, and after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt. He returned again in the 143rd year, this is 171, and went up against Israel in Jerusalem with a great multitude. He entered proudly into the sanctuary, took away the golden altar, the candlestick of light and all the vessels, the table of the showbread, the pouring vessels, all the vials, took the silver and the gold and the precious vessels, took the hidden treasures. And when he had taken all away, he went to his own land, having made a great massacre and spoken very proudly. So he came back from Egypt, you see, up through Judea. Everything that wasn't nailed down, he took with him. And 2 years expired, which would bring us down to 169. And he sent his chief collector of tribute unto the cities of Judea, who came to Jerusalem to a great multitude. And he spoke peaceable words unto them, but all was deceit. When they had given him credence, he fell suddenly upon the city, smote it very sore. So he came in, and he was, trying to be very clever and crafty, and took spoils of the city, and burned part of it, pulled down the houses, and they built the city of David with a great strong wall, made a stronghold. Well, they shed innocent blood on every side of the sanctuary and defiled it, insomuch that the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of him. The city became a habitation of strangers. King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and every one should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yes, many also of Israel consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem, and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices. He sent letters that they should follow the strange laws of the land, forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and the festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and the holy people. So he did all of this, sent this, the letter that was sent out forbidding sacrifices was sent out right after the Feast of Tabernacles in 167 B.C. And he forbade burnt offerings and sacrifices, forbade the drink offerings, all the offerings in the temple. Now, that wasn't the end of it. In the 15th day of the month Keslev, which is the 9th month of the sacred calendar, just a matter of a few weeks, this would be, let's say, 2 months after the beginning of the Feast of Tabernacles, about maybe 5 or 6 weeks after he had sent his decree forbidding burnt sacrifices, the 15th day of the month Keslev, in 167, they set up the Abomination of Desolation upon the altar, and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. And when they had rent in pieces the books of the law which were found, they burnt them with fire. And whoever was bound with any book of the testament, or if any consented to the law, the king's commandment was that he should be put to death. So now we have an event that I don't think it takes much commentary to show that this historical event was certainly a type of the Great Tribulation. Here was Antiochus, and he came in. He issued a decree that ordered the burnt sacrifices to stop. And then a matter of a few weeks later, he showed up, and they set up an idol. They set up actually an idol of Jupiter Olympus in the sanctuary of the temple in Jerusalem. And the temple of God was rededicated to Jupiter Olympus. Now, there's a little interesting point on that. There is a large statue in the Vatican today It is a great, large, black statue that if you were to go there, they would tell you that is St. Peter. And, they can prove it because his toe is kissed away. So many people have come through the door and they've all kissed the toe and they've worn the big toe off. It's been there for a long time. That statue was not originally a statue of St. Peter. It was an old statue that was, had a little holy water sprinkled on it, and now it was St. Peter. But it didn't start out as St. Peter. It was originally a statue of Jupiter Olympus. It originally held a scepter which was cut out, and the scepter was replaced with keys. And so it used to be a statue of Jupiter Olympus, but now it's a statue of Peter. It was a statue of Jupiter Olympus. It was a very similar statue that was set up in the temple of God in Jerusalem the 15th day of the 9th month in 167 B.C. And a decree was issued. There was an attempt made to destroy all copies of Scripture. Anyone who was found, any Jew who was unwilling to go along with this was told that they were under the death penalty. If anyone was found with a copy of the Bible, the king's commandment was that they should put him to death. Howbeit, many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat any unclean thing, and they chose rather to die, that they might not be defiled, might not profane the holy covenant. Well, in those days there arose Matthias, the son of John, the son of Simeon, a priest of the sons of Jorib from Jerusalem, and he dwelt in Modin. And he had 5 sons. One of those sons was Judas, called Maccabee. And that's the story. That's where the term the Maccabees come from. Matthias, the priest, and his sons withdrew from Jerusalem, went to the village of Modin. Well, in the meanwhile, the king's officers, such as compelled the people to revolt, came into the city of Modin to make them sacrifice. They came around to all the villages, you see, bringing these idols with them, and compelled everybody to come up and offer devotion to the altar of the idol. This was to insist that everyone had to give allegiance, you see, to this false religion. Well, when many of Israel came to them, Matthias and his sons came together, and the king's officers called Matthias to come up first. They said, "You're a ruler and an honorable and a great man in the city, so you come first and fulfill the king's commandment." Well, Matthias answered and spoke with a loud voice, "Though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the ordinances. We will not hearken to the king's words to go from our religion either on the right hand or to the left." And when he had left speaking, there came one of the Jews in the sight of all to sacrifice on the altar. He was going to get in good with them, with these Greeks. And when Matthias saw it, he could not forbear to show his anger according to judgment, and he ran and slew him upon the altar. And then the king's commissioner he killed at the same time, and he pulled the altar down. Thus did he zealously for the law of God, like Phinehas did unto Zambri the son of Salom. And Matthias cried throughout the city with a loud voice, saying, "Whoever is zealous of the law and maintains the covenant, let him follow me." So he and his sons fled into the mountains and left all that they had in the city. Well, this began what is known as the Maccabee Revolt. And as we come on down through the story, we find that ultimately, 3 years later, the Maccabees were victorious, and that they came in, they recaptured Jerusalem, as is described. And I'm skipping over a lot of the details, but Judas Maccabee, his father Matthias was dead by this time during the course of these 3 years, but Judas appointed certain men to fight against those that were in the fortress until he had cleansed the sanctuary. He chose priests of blameless conversation, such as had pleasure in the law, who cleansed the sanctuary. They bore out the defiled stones into an unclean place. They took whole stones according to the law, built a new altar according to the former, made up the sanctuary, the things that were in the temple, hallowed the courts, made new holy vessels. Upon the altar they burned incense. They set the loaves upon the tables, spread out the veils, finished all the works. And on the 25th day of the 9th month, the month Keslev, in the 148th year, which is 164, they rose up early in the morning and offered sacrifice according to the law upon the new altar of burnt offerings which they had made. Now, if you want to do a little math, you will find there were offerings that were offered every morning and every evening. 2,300 evenings and mornings. You remember we were told Daniel had prophesied that this little horn would come in, would take away this was in Daniel 8:11. The continual burnt offering was taken away, the place of the sanctuary cast down, and it was given over, the continual burnt offering. It was cast down. How long? Verse 14 of Daniel 8, 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. There were 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices that did not take place. That translates into 1,150 days. And if you want to track it out on the calendar, you'll find that from the time Antiochus issued his decree, just shortly after the close, just within a week or so of the close of the Feast of Tabernacles in 167, if you track it out, from the time he issued his decree and ordered the cessation of daily sacrifices until the 25th day of the 9th month, just slightly over 3 years later, comes out to exactly 1,150 days. There were 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices that were not offered from the time Antiochus stopped them until the rededication of the altar and the reinstitution of daily sacrifices given here as described in the book of 1 Maccabees. Now, Maccabees describes what Antiochus set up. There were two things. One, he stopped the daily sacrifice and he set up the abomination of desolation. Now, Maccabees describes historically what any Jew of Jesus' day would have understood when you said abomination of desolation. They were very aware of what had happened, of the history of King Antiochus and his setting up of this idol in the temple at Jerusalem. And then the temple was cleansed by the Maccabees in 164. That cleansing of the temple and that rededication was known as the Feast of Dedication, or as it's better known from its Hebrew title, Hanukkah. It is referred to in the book of John, being in Jerusalem at that particular time for the Feast of Dedication, as it's mentioned back around back in the Gospel of John, so here was a festival that began to be celebrated, not a holy day of God, but a national day of Thanksgiving, one that was celebrated every year, and of course is celebrated in the Jewish community to this time as it comes on down. But the point is that when Jesus talked about the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, he was speaking of an historic event, something that was known as the abomination by all of the Jews, something that is specifically described historically in the book of Daniel. As you go through Daniel 8 and you read about the Persians and the Greeks under Alexander, and then the empire being split into 4 directions, and out of one of those 4 horns came a little horn, which is clearly Antiochus as you come on down historically. So we have this particular event, and there was a time when the sacrifice was stopped and an idol altar set up. And that was called historically the abomination of desolation. Now, in Daniel chapter 9, we have another vision that is described. Daniel was praying to God and he had been fasting for 3 weeks, beseeching God to help him understand certain things about in asking God's mercy in terms of the nation. So he receives a vision here in Daniel chapter 9. An angel comes and appears to him, and we'll pick up the account that Pick up the account here in Daniel chapter 9, verse 20. While I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin, the man Gabriel, verse 21, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, caused to fly swiftly and approach closely to me at about the time of the evening offering. And he began to make me understand. Verse 24, 70 weeks are decreed upon your people and upon your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and discern that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. Now, here we read a prophecy, 70 weeks are determined upon your people. From the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. Now, when did the commandment go forth to restore and to build Jerusalem? Well, if you want to hold in your place in your Bible and turn back to Ezra chapter 7. Verse 1, after these things in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, talks about Ezra coming on down. Ezra went up from Babylon, and verse 8, he came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, in the 7th year of the king. On the 1st day of the 1st month, he began to go up from Babylon. 1st day of the 5th month, he came to Jerusalem. And this is the copy of the letter, verse 11, that King Artaxerxes gave unto Ezra the priest. And we find here this decree that the king sent. And I make a decree, verse 21, to all the treasurers beyond the river, give Ezra the things that he commands. Now, the decree that went forth here, that was issued in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes, which, if you want to check it out in a history book, it was in 457. It was in 457 BC. He allowed people to return to Jerusalem and to do the things that were needed and to rebuild. Now, 457 BC was the date of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. 70 weeks. Well, 70 weeks, that's 490 days. We're told here that 7 weeks and 69 weeks. There was a breakdown here into two categories, 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which makes a total of 69 weeks. If you want to do a little math on that, you'll find that 69 weeks is 483 days. And if you come down from 457 BC, 483 days will bring you down to 27 AD, which comes out to the time of Jesus' public appearance as the Messiah, the time of his baptism by John. Now, what we're told is that these weeks would transpire and that they were determined upon your people, upon the holy city. They would bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision and the prophecy, anoint the Messiah, anoint the most holy. From the going forth of the decree to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, Prince, would be this period of 69 weeks. And after this period had elapsed, verse 26, the Messiah shall be cut off and be no more. The Messiah will be cut off And the people of a prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now, did that happen? Well, the Messiah did come, and the Messiah was cut off. And afterward, the people of a prince came to destroy the city. Originally, Vespasian, who was a prince, he was heir to the throne, when he took the throne as Roman emperor, his son Titus was the one who actually oversaw the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. Titus later went on to become emperor, but he was a prince at the time. And so the city was destroyed and the sanctuary. Now, here's an interesting thing. At the time Daniel wrote this, the temple hadn't even been rebuilt. The temple hadn't been rebuilt when Daniel wrote this. When Daniel wrote this, there was no temple. Solomon's temple was destroyed. Daniel foresaw not only the rebuilding of the temple, but the fact that the temple would be destroyed after the Messiah had come. Now, historically, the temple was destroyed, 70 A.D. That's not really even a point of argument. So, Daniel chapter 9, anybody who wants to argue about it, the Messiah had to have come prior to the destruction of the Second Temple. There are a number of prophecies that point that out. Now, there's an interesting and sort of ambiguous place right here at the end of chapter 9, verse 27. He shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, and for half the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the offering to cease, and upon the wing of detestable things shall be that which causes appallment, and that until the extermination wholly determined be poured out upon that which causes appallment, or upon the abomination. The King James renders it, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he'll cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. And that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. Now, you can read that two different ways, and it's written in an ambiguous way, and even the Jewish commentary brings out, there are a couple of different ways of reading it. Sometimes we have read it, and that the fact of the Messiah, you see, the question is, who is the he in verse 27? Does the he refer back to the Messiah or to the prince? The prince is the last one mentioned in verse 26. The prince who would come to destroy the city. Well, did Vespasian make a covenant for a week? Well, interestingly enough, Vespasian did sign a treaty with the Jews. It was a 7-year treaty of peace, which he violated. And before it was half over, he had laid siege to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was destroyed. Now, the other way of reading it is that the he refers back to the Messiah, who made a covenant. You see, he came to make the new covenant, and he was cut off in the midst of the week. His ministry was 3.5 years, and he was cut off in the midst of the week. And in that sense, he caused sacrifice and oblation to cease in the sense that he offered one sacrifice for sins forever. If you read it as the prince, he caused sacrifices to cease because his armies moved in and he destroyed Jerusalem, and the sacrificial system ceased in 70 A.D. The temple structure ceased in 70 A.D. So it's interesting, the aspects of it. Now, as we come on into chapter 10, Daniel is here, and again, another vision. He sees an angel, and he sees this vision that is recorded as we come on down. And what we find, the vision begins to be recorded in chapter 11, and it is the most detailed prophecy in the Bible. In chapter 11, verse 2, Daniel was told, there will stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth will be far richer than they all. And when he's waxed strong through his riches, he'll stir up many against the realm of Greece. And a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And that would be a reference to Alexander the Great. And when he stands up, his kingdom will be divided to the 4 winds of heaven, not according to his posterity. We already saw that in detail back in Daniel 8. So this is Alexander. He dies. The empire is split 4 ways. Now we go into a focus on 2 of Alexander's successor kings, called here the king of the south and the king of the north. Now, the Seleucids, this is from the direction of Jerusalem, the Seleucids up in north of Jerusalem, Syria and Babylon, and the Ptolemies down south of Jerusalem in Egypt. And the focus here in the rest of Daniel 11 is on the Seleucid and Ptolemy dynasties, on the kings of the north and the kings of the south, because those were the ones who interacted with the people of God. By this time, the descendants of Lysimachus and Cassander up in the north and the west portion of the empire, that they simply didn't figure in anymore in events that happened in the Middle East. Well, what we have is this very detailed description, continuing here in Daniel 11, of the interaction between what are called the kings of the north and the king of the south. The battles back and forth between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. One of them would come in and try to conquer the other one, and they would enter into a treaty of friendship, or one of them would marry the daughter or the sister of the other, and there was all this intrigue going back and forth over a period of from there on down to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes would have been, about 130 years. And this is described in detail here in Daniel 11. I won't go into all of that. Most commentaries are pretty accurate on their description of the historic details brought out here of Daniel 11, because it is just a matter of the historical correlation of these kings fighting back and forth. It is an amazingly detailed prophecy. The critics have to try and date the book of Daniel after all of these things had happened, you see, because what are they going to do? They try to date it, the critics try to date it all the way down after the time of the Maccabees, because the prophecies of Daniel are so clear and so specific that they have one of 2 choices. They either have to accept that there's a God in heaven who can foresee the future and who inspired these things, or they have to say, well, it was written long after the fact. Well, they have trouble proving that altogether. Anyway, as we come on down here in Daniel 11, let's pick it up. We get into the account of Antiochus in Daniel 11:21. And in his place there shall stand up a contemptible person, upon whom had not been conferred the majesty of the kingdom, but he shall come in time of security, and shall obtain the kingdom by blandishments. So here was one. Antiochus had been a hostage in Rome. His brother was the king, and his brother was assassinated. His brother had a son that should have been then in line to be king. Antiochus came back from Rome, and through various conniving and maneuvering, managed to get rid of his nephew and to take the kingdom himself. He's called here a contemptible person. And so we find the events. The prince of the covenant referred to in verse 22 would most likely be the high priest. And a league was set up. He shall work deceitfully, verse 23. He shall come up and be strong. With a little nation in time of security shall he come even into the fattest places of the province. Speaking there, the area of Galilee and other areas that were the most prosperous areas there. And he shall scatter among them a prey, shall stir up his power and his courage, verse 25, against the king of the south with a great army. And he did. He went down. He tried to make war with the king of the south, with Ptolemy. And in verse 29, at the time appointed he shall return and come to the south, but it shall not be as in the latter time as it was in the former, for the ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be cowed. When he got there the second time, the Roman fleet was waiting off the coast of Egypt and said, we don't want you expanding your empire and gobbling up Egypt. That will make you too strong. If you attack Egypt, you attack us. And so he was cowed. And he shall return, verse 30, and have indignation against the holy covenant. That's when he came back through and looted Jerusalem. He was in a rage from the fact that he'd had to back down on his attack on Egypt. So he came back through and attacked Jerusalem. Shall do his pleasure. He shall return, have regard to them that forsake the holy covenant. You see, the apostate Jews who were willing to go along with him. Arms shall stand up on his part, and they shall profane the sanctuary, even the stronghold, and shall take away the continual burnt offering. And they shall set up the detestable thing that causes appalment, set up the abomination of desolation. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by blandishments. But the people that do know their God shall show strength and do exploits. They that are wise among the people shall cause many to understand. So he goes on, and at this point in Daniel 11, the prophecy begins to expand and to go beyond the historic events of the time of the Maccabees and to come on down to the end time. Because as we get on through the remainder here of chapter 11, verse 40, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and many ships. Enter into the countries, shall overflow and pass through, shall enter into the beauteous land, see, into the land of Israel. Many countries shall be overthrown, these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom, Moab, the chief of the children of Ammon. Stretch forth his hand upon the countries, the land of Egypt shall not escape, will have power over the treasures of gold and silver, the precious things of Egypt. Libyans and Ethiopians will be at his steps. Tidings out of the east and the north will affright him. He'll go forth with great fury to destroy and to utterly make away many. Now, we're looking on beyond Antiochus at this point. We're looking to the end time, because notice verse 1 of chapter 12. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince who stands for the children of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. Now, Jesus in Matthew 24 talked about a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. Here we read of it right here in Daniel 12. And at that time your people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book, and many of them that sleep in the dust shall awake. Okay, now we're down to the time of the resurrection. You see, we're down to the time of the coming of Christ. Some to everlasting life, some to reproaches and everlasting abhorrence. And they that are wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. But you, O Daniel, shut up the word, seal the book, even till the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. And Daniel looked, and in verse 6 he asked, how long shall it be to the end of the wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, and he lifted up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and he swore by him that lives forever, that it shall be for a time and times and a half a time, 3.5 years, when they have made an end of breaking in pieces the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So we're looking here, the breaking in power, you see, this is the time of the captivity, of the fall of Israel and Judah. This period of time, times and a half a time, 3.5 years. The time of the tribulation. And I heard, but I understood not. And I said, O my Lord, what shall be the latter end of these things? And he said, go your way, Daniel. The words are shut up and sealed. Many will purify themselves and make themselves white. The wicked shall do wickedly. None of the wicked shall understand. They that are wise shall understand. Verse 11. From the time that the continual burnt offering shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Happy is he that waits and comes to the 1,335 days. But go your way till the end be. You shall rest and shall stand up in your lot at the end of the days. All of these days end at the same time. They end at the resurrection. They end at the time when Daniel will stand in his lot, in his portion. They stand at the time of the resurrection. We find here several periods of days. If they end at the same time, they begin at different times. We're told here that the abomination that makes desolate will be set up, that the continual burnt offering will be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up 1,290 days. From the time the sacrifice is taken away, the abomination set up, there will be 1,290 days. Well, 1,260 days, see, time times and a half a time, 42 months, that's 1,260 days. So that is a month before the onset of a month before the captivity. A month before the captivity. An event is going to occur 45 days prior to that, and we're not told what that event is. We're just told, blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1335 days. There is an event to occur 45 days before the abomination, and many have speculated about different things, but that's what it is. It is there is an event that will take place. But we find here that when Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Well, what abomination of desolation did Daniel speak of? Historically, Daniel described the events that occurred when Antiochus Epiphanes came in and stopped the sacrifices and set up an idol there in the temple in Jerusalem, and began then a systematic persecution, an attempt to wipe out any record of the truth. Now, prophetically, what we're going to see is that once again the events of the tribulation are very similar to what's described right here. There's going to be an attempt to enforce conformity and to punish and to persecute anyone who tries to hold on to the truth. That's the martyrdom of the saints described in Revelation chapter 6 under the fifth seal. The events that were historically typed at the time of Antiochus. Antiochus Epiphanes, then, is a type of the beast, a type of this final individual. So it's interesting when you read the description of him, he is described as a contemptible person who obtains the kingdom by stratagems, by crafty maneuvers, to whom they do not give the honor of the kingdom. He's not someone that was automatically held in great high esteem and everybody wanted him in there, but rather he obtains the kingdom through craftiness. He's described as a contemptible person, but an individual who will come to power through various crafty maneuvers. That was something that characterized Antiochus, undoubtedly will characterize this final beast. So, as we look at the historical fulfillment, Jesus emphasized that the abomination that there would come in the future, there would come at a time prior to His return, in the event signaling His return, there would come an abomination of desolation, the one spoken of by Daniel. So what had occurred historically was to give insight and understanding as to what would occur in the future. And that, of course, I think is exactly what we're going to see. Now, in order for sacrifices to be stopped, they have to be started. And we are in a very crucial time. I think most of you probably are aware that the spring of 1999, just a matter of a few months away, between now and the Feast of Tabernacles next year, some extraordinary things may very well happen, because the Oslo Accord that was signed by Israel and by the Palestinians set a date of May 1999 as the time for the final settlement of the status of Jerusalem and of the occupied territories. Now, May 1999 sounded a long ways away a few years ago. May 1999 is a very short time away right now. It's about 7, 8 months. That's not long. They have not made a lot of progress in settling the final status of Jerusalem, as you might well imagine. Yasser Arafat has said, he has gone on record as saying that if the Oslo Accord is not completely implemented as they have all agreed that it would be by May of 99, then he will at that time unilaterally declare the Palestinians as an independent state. Now, because there's already been a treaty signed, if he is to do that, you can rest assured that he will be recognized certainly by all of the Arab world and by many other nations as well. And so there is a great pressure that is coming to bear in the Middle East And, you know, God, we're told, we saw this morning in the sermon in Acts 17, that God has determined the times before appointed. He set the bounds of their habitation, set the times before appointed. So God has a time schedule. You and I know that schedule only in a very general overall sense. The exact details of it, there are things that can speed things up, there are things that can slow it down. When God's time comes for events to happen, they can happen oh so quickly. This was proven in the fall of 1989. God is right on schedule. You and I will have to simply wait and see exactly how some of these details unfold. But I think what we're going to clearly see is that you have events in the Middle East and you have events in Europe. And that ultimately one who comes to power in Europe will play a crucial role in the Middle East. He will be the equivalent of Antiochus Epiphanes. And I think it very likely, on the basis of some of these statements, that he will enter into some sort of treaty, which will, of course, be violated, and will see the cessation of sacrifices and the setting up of the abomination. The historical background for these events gives us a basis for being able to understand and to know what to watch for the future. Jesus Christ called our attention to the historical fulfillment when He said, the abominations spoken of by Daniel the prophet. The one Daniel described. And when you go through Daniel 8, historically there was one. And the sacrifices were ceased for a period of 1,150 days, 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now that was the historic fulfillment. In the future, they will cease, and that will begin a countdown of 1,290 days until the coming of the Messiah. And that is the event. It is, of course, the outgrowth of the coming of the Messiah that we're here celebrating at this Feast of Tabernacles. I think it is important for us to be aware of the times in which we live, and just the fact that we are seeing shape up on the world scene the events that many of us in this room for 20, 30, maybe 40 years have anticipated. Things that Mr. Herbert Armstrong talked about decades ago, when there was nothing on the world scene to indicate it. But you see, he saw it in this book. And he taught it and he explained it. And he was a man decades ahead of his time, because he was teaching out of a book that was centuries and millennia ahead of its time. Because this book is God's book. And God declares the end from the beginning. Well, thank you much for your time and attention. And I appreciate you coming to the Bible study this evening. And I look forward to seeing you one final time tomorrow morning.